Chapter 10 of Windsor Castle, Book 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Amy Graymore. Windsor Castle, Book 2, by William H. Ainsworth. Chapter 10. How Herne the Hunter was himself hunted. On the guard's recovery, information of what had occurred was immediately conveyed to the king, who had not yet retired to rest, but was sitting in his private chamber with the Dukes of Suffolk and Norfolk. The intelligence threw him into a great fury. He buffeted the guard, and ordered him to be locked up in the dungeon whence the prisoner had escaped, reprimanded the canon, directed the Duke of Suffolk with a patrol to make search in the neighbourhood of the castle for the fugitive and the friar, and bade the Duke of Norfolk get together a band of arquebusiers, and as soon as the latter were assembled, he put himself at their head and again rode into the forest. The cavalcade had proceeded about a mile along the great avenue, when one of the arquebusiers rode up and said that he heard some distant sounds on the right. Commanding a halt, Henry listened for a moment, and satisfied that the man was right, quitted the course he was pursuing, and dashed across the broad glade now traversed by the avenue called Queen Anne's Ride. As he advanced, the rapid trampling of horses was heard, accompanied by shouts, and presently afterwards a troop of wild-looking horsemen, in fantastic garbs, was seen galloping down the hill, pursued by Bouchier and his followers. The king immediately shaped his course so as to intercept the flying party, and being in some measure screened by the trees, he burst unexpectedly upon them at a turn of the road. Henry called to the fugitives to surrender, but they refused, and brandishing their long knives and spears, made a desperate resistance, but they were speedily surrounded and overpowered. Bouchier inquired from the king what should be done with the prisoners. "Hang them all upon yon trees," cried Henry, pointing to two sister oaks which stood near the scene of strife. The terrible sentence was immediately carried into execution. Cords were produced, and in less than half an hour 20 breathless bodies were swinging from the branches of the two trees indicated by the king. "This will serve to deter others from like offences," observed Henry, who had watched the whole proceedings with savage satisfaction. "And now, Bouchier, how came you to let the leader of these villains escape?" "I did not know he had escaped, my liege," replied Bouchier in astonishment. "Yea, marry, but he has escaped," rejoined Henry, "and he has had the audacity to show himself in the castle within this hour, and the cunning, moreover, to set the prisoner free." And he proceeded to relate what had occurred. "This is strange indeed, my liege," replied Bouchier, at the close of the king's recital, "and to my thinking is proof convincing that we have to do with a supernatural being." "Supernatural, pshaw! Banish the idle notion," rejoined Henry sternly. "We are all the dupes of some jugglery. The caitiff will doubtless return to the forest. Continue your search therefore for him throughout the night. If you catch him, I promise you a royal reward." So saying, he rode back to the castle, somewhat appeased by the wholesale vengeance he had taken upon the offenders. In obedience to the orders he had received, Bouchier, with his followers, continued riding about the forest during the whole night, but without finding anything to reward his search, until about dawn it occurred to him to return to the trees on which the bodies were suspended. As he approached them, he fancied he beheld a horse standing beneath the nearest tree, and immediately ordered his followers to proceed as noiselessly as possible, and to keep under the cover of the wood. A nearer advance convinced him that his eyes had not deceived him. It was a swart, wild-looking horse that he beheld, with eyes that flamed like carbuncles, while a couple of bodies, evidently snatched from the branches, were laid across his back. A glance at the trees, too, showed Bouchier they had been considerably lightened of their hideous spoil. Seeing this, Bouchier dashed forward. Alarmed by the noise, the wild horse neighed loudly, and a dark figure instantly dropped from the tree upon its back, and proceeded to disencumber it of its load. But before this could be accomplished, a bolt from a crossbow, shot by one of Bouchier's followers, pierced the animal's brain. Rearing aloft, it fell backwards in such manner as would have crushed an ordinary rider, but Herne slipped off uninjured, and with incredible swiftness darted among the trees. The others started in pursuit, and a chase commenced in which the demon huntsman had to sustain the part of the deer, nor could any deer have afforded better sport. Away flew the pursued and pursuers over broad glade and through tangled glen, the woods resounding with their cries. Bouchier did not lose sight of the fugitive for a moment, and urged his men to push on, But despite his alternate proffers and menaces, they gained but little on Herne, who, speeding towards the home park, cleared its high palings with a single bound. Over went Bouchier and his followers, and they then descried him making his way to a large oak standing almost alone in the centre of a wide glade. An instant afterwards he reached the tree, shook his arm menacingly at his pursuers, and vanished. The next moment Bouchier came up, flung himself from his panting steed, and with his drawn sword in hand forced himself through a rift in its side into the tree. There was a hollow within it large enough to allow a man to stand, and two funnel like holes ran upwards into the branches. Finding nothing, Bouchier called for a hunting spear, and thrust it as far as he could into the holes above. The point encountered no obstruction except such as was offered by the wood itself. He stamped upon the ground and sounded it on all sides with the spear, but with no better success. Issuing forth, he next directed his attention to the upper part of the tree, which, while he was occupied inside, had been very carefully watched by his followers, and not content with viewing it from below, he clambered into the branches, but they had nothing to show except their own leafy covering. The careful examination of the ground about the tree at length led to the discovery of a small hole among its roots, about half a dozen yards from the trunk; and though this hole seemed scarcely large enough to serve for an entrance to the burrow of a fox, Bouchier deemed it expedient to keep a careful watch over it. His investigation completed, he dispatched a sergeant of the guard to the castle to acquaint the king with what had occurred. Disturbed by the events of the night, Henry obtained little sleep, and at an early hour summoned an attendant, and demanded whether there were any tidings from the forest. The attendant replied that a sergeant of the guard was without, sent by Captain Bouchier with a message for his majesty. The sergeant was immediately admitted to the royal presence, and on the close of his marvellous story, the king, who had worked himself into a tremendous fury during its relation, roared out, "What! foiled again? Ha! But he shall not escape. If I have to root up half the trees in the forest, Bouchier and his fellows must be bewitched. Hark ye, knaves! Get together a dozen of the best woodsmen and yeomen in the castle, instantly, as you value your lives. Bid them bring axe and saw, pick and spade. D'ye mark me? Ha! Stay, I have not done. I must have faggots and straw, for I will burn this tree to the ground. Burn it to a char. Summon the Dukes of Suffolk and Norfolk, the rascal archer I dubbed the Duke of Shoreditch and his mates, the keepers of the forest and their hounds. Summon them quickly, and bid a band of the yeomen to the guard get ready." And he sprang from his couch. The king's commands were executed with such alacrity that by the time he was fully attired, the whole of the persons he had ordered to be summoned were assembled. Putting himself at their head, he rode forth to the home park, and found Bouchier and his followers grouped around the tree. "We are still at fault, my liege," said Bouchier. "So I see, sir," replied the king angrily. "Hew down the tree instantly, knaves," he added to the woodmen. "Fall to, fall to." Ropes were then fastened to the head of the tree, and the welkin resounded with the rapid strokes of the hatchet. It was a task of some difficulty, but such zeal and energy were displayed by the woodmen, that ere long the giant trunk lay prostrate on the ground. Its hollows were now fully exposed to view, but they were empty. "Set fire to the accursed piece of timber," roared the king, "and burn it to dust, and scatter it to the wind." At these orders two yeomen of the guard advanced, and throwing down a heap of faggots, straw, and other combustibles on the roots of the tree, soon kindled a fierce fire. Meanwhile a couple of woodmen stripped off their jerkins, and with their brawny arms bared to shoulder, mounted on the trunk, and strove to splinter it asunder. Some of the keepers likewise got into the branches, and peered into every crack and crevice, in the hope of making some discovery. Amongst the latter was Will Sommers, who had posted himself near a great arm of the tree, which he maintained, when lopped off, would be found to contain the demon. Nor were there other expedients neglected. A fierce hound had been sent into the hole near the roots of the tree by Gabriel Lapp, but after a short absence he returned howling and terrified. Nor could all the efforts of Gabriel, seconded by a severe scourging with his heavy dog whip, induce them to enter it again. But after a short absence he returned howling and terrified, nor could all the efforts of Gabriel, seconded by a severe scourging with his heavy dog whip, induce him to enter it again. When the hound had come forth, a couple of yeomen advanced to enlarge the opening, while a third with a pick endeavoured to remove the root, which formed an impediment to their efforts. "They may dig, but they'll never catch him," observed Shoreditch, who stood by, to his companions. Hunting a spirit is not the same thing as training and raising a wolf, or earthing and digging out a badger." "Not so loud, Duke," said Islington; "his Majesty may think thy jest irreverent." "I have had an arrow blessed by a priest," said Paddington, "which I shall let fly at the spirit if he appears." "Here he is! Here he is!" cried Will Sommers, as a great white horned owl, which had been concealed in some part of the tree, flew forth. "It may be the demon in that form. Shoot! Shoot!" cried Shoreditch. Paddington bent his bow. The arrow whistled through the air, and in another moment the owl fell fluttering to the ground completely transfixed. But it underwent no change, as was expected by the credulous archer. Meanwhile the fire, being kept constantly supplied with fresh faggots and stirred by the yeomen of the guard, burned bravely. The lower part of the tree was already consumed, and the flames, roaring through the hollow within with a sound like that of a furnace, promised soon to reduce it to charcoal. The mouth of the hole having now been widened, another keeper, who had brought forth a couple of lurchers, sent them into it; but in a few moments they returned as the hound had done, howling and with scared looks. Without heeding their enraged master, they ran off, with their tails between their legs, towards the castle. "I see how it is, Rufus," said Gabriel, patting his hound, who looked wistfully and half reproachfully at him. "Thou wert not to blame, poor fellow. The best dog that ever was whelped cannot be expected to face the devil." Though long ere this had become the general opinion that it was useless to persevere further in the search, the king, with his characteristic obstinacy, would not give it up. In due time the whole of the trunk of the enormous tree was consumed, and its branches cast into the fire. The roots were rent from the ground, and a wide and deep trench digged around the spot. The course of the hole was traced for some distance, but it was never of any size, and was suddenly lost by the falling in of the earth. At length, after 5 hours' close watching, Henry's patience was exhausted, and he ordered the pit to be filled up, and every crevice and fissure in the ground about to be carefully stopped. "If we cannot unkennel the fox," he said, "we will at least earth him up." "For all your care, gossip Henry," muttered Will Sommers as he rode after his royal master to the castle, "the fox will work his way out." Thus ends the second book of the Chronicle of Windsor Castle. End of Chapter 10, and end of Book 2 of Windsor Castle. Recording by Amy Graymore, Holton, Maine. amysmind to yourmind.com